Today on Locked On Red Wings, a 2024 draft profile on winger Beckett Sennecke featuring Max Bultman of The Athletic.
You're Locked On Red Wings, your daily podcast on the Detroit Red Wings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Red Wings podcast. We are your hosts, Brian Fisher and Scotty Bentley. I'm formerly of 97.1 The Ticket, and Scotty's host over at Locked On Tigers, as well as a freelance journalist for the Detroit News. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Scotty, we are happy to be welcoming back friend of the podcast and just friend in general, Max Bultman, the Detroit Red Wings beat writer for The Athletic. He's going to help us break down, by help us, I mean do the heavy lifting on a draft profile for Beckett Sennecke of the Oshawa Generals. Max, first, thank you again for joining us, and how are you doing, man?
Always, guys. I'm doing really good and enjoying some sunlight here the last couple of days. How about you?
Yeah, hey man, I'll take all the weather I can get. Mostly just, as Brian said off air, just hoping for the Tigers to play decent ball is pretty much what's happening in my neck of the woods.
I thought I might see a JV no hitter the other day at the ballpark. It was he was looking really good, and yeah, I know, but yeah, yep, there's that.
It is, not gonna lie, it is unbearably hot in this room right here because the heat rises in this townhouse and all our stuff's on the second floor and our thermostat's on the first floor. So even though it's 68 or set to 68, it is like 80 up here, it feels like. So that's how I'm doing right now. I am melting. Anyways, let's get right into it. We got a draft profile to talk about, and if we have some time, Max, I'd like to pick your brain a little bit about your thoughts on the Red Wings season as well. And first and foremost, Beckett Sennecke, for those who are unaware, he is a 2024 draft eligible prospect. He plays right wing. I'm just literally reading the elite prospects profile for people. He's about 181 pounds, 6'2". This season he scored 68 points in 63 games in regular season with the Oshawa Generals of the OHL. And in the playoffs, he's got 22 and 16 thus far. Max, when it comes to Beckett Sennecke, why did you choose to talk about him with us? Because I remember I approached you and I said, hey, who do you want to talk about? Well, your first option got sniped by Tony Ferrari, who we'll talk about later in the week. But your second option was Beckett Sennecke. Like, what draws you to him as the Detroit Red Wings beat writer?
Yeah, well, I think he just fills a lot of the things that they could use as part of it. And he's a tremendous prospect. He's probably, I don't know if he's going to be the biggest riser because he was already like in a pretty good place coming into the springtime, but his OHL playoffs definitely put him in a spot where he's, I think, going to go a lot higher than a lot of people realize. I actually don't think he's even going to be available at 15 for the Red Wings. So I guess I should get that out of the way at the beginning. But I'll also say the last 2 years, guys, when I've come on to do these draft profiles, the prospects that we have talked about were Marco Kasper and Nate Danielson.
2 for 2, man.
Yeah, so maybe this is who knows? Maybe I'm wrong about him going before the Red Wings, and we go 3 for 3 here. But yeah, I just think he checks a lot of the in terms of the fit for the Red Wings. He might be the ideal player for them to come away with in this draft. Even if it were, I would consider trading up for this player. Like you said, he's 6'2". He skates really well for that size. He is skinny, so it's not as much of the like kind of killer mentality that you might hope for from a 6'2" forward, but his hands are outstanding. He gets to the hard areas of the ice. He has had an outstanding OHL playoffs. His numbers in the OHL playoffs as a draft eligible are, I think, identical to what Nate Danielson has done in the Western Hockey League playoffs. And I know Red Wings fans are really excited about what they've seen from that. So to me, when I look at what the Red Wings are missing, it is some size up front. It is certainly some skill up front. He brings both of those things. He brings the pace. I just think it's as good of a fit as you could probably hope for the Red Wings in this draft. I don't know that he's going to be there, like I said, but that's the guy who I think if you wanted to wish for something, this is the one I would say you put out there into the universe.
Well, I mean, you mentioned there that he's going to be one of the bigger risers. Is there anything specific for that other than just like he had a really good year, or was there like a lot that's gone into like his stock rising specifically?
I think it's just the how much he's done in the playoffs, right? Like
Yeah.
it's, you see him in those games, and that's the most recent data point. So that always contributes to a rise. Guys who kind of turn in those performances late in the year. There's other guys, at the World Championships right now. You talked about Brent Nygaard, who I think it really fits the Red Wings as well. There's another guy on that Norwegian team in this draft class, Stian Solberg, who's a 6'2" left shot defenseman. And I think he's going to end up being a riser based on the looks that teams are going to get at him at that event. So I think when we talk about the risers, a lot of times it ends up being people who have had the opportunity to make a kind of a closing statement and then be made the most of it. Right. And the fallers can sometimes be the opposite.
And for what it's worth, if it ends up being Brandsdeg Nygaard, I believe it is, we will still give you credit because that is the guy you first wanted to talk about. So we'll still give you credit as being a oracle.
Oh, good. So I get to double my odds here.
Yeah, there you go. You get 2 this year. Yeah.
Because you did pick him out first, but Tony beat you to it as I'm setting up multiple interviews for draft season. Talk about areas of improvement for his game. You talk about he's got size. You talk about he's got skill. He's kind of that top 6 scoring winger, maybe. None of these prospects, not even Macklin Celebrini, right, is perfect coming out of the draft. They all have areas of improvement. What do you see as an area of improvement for somebody like Sennecke?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think you want to see him be stronger. When you think about like a 6'2" frame, you do want a certain level of like kind of meanness to that. I know in our draft guide that Corey Prodman has, or his most recent board, at least, he talked about kind of his effort level being fine and not maybe like a true selling point. I'd say when I've watched him, I've had no issue with it. And maybe that's what he means. Like it's fine. He's not like in the like kind of Marco Casper kind of mold where he's getting into everything around the whistle from what I've seen. But and I can't say that I've seen his whole body of work from the season. A lot of what I've seen from him has been in these playoffs. And so if he's rising based on a great playoffs, I'm sure I've seen much more of the more favorable things that he has on tape. So, but I think the biggest thing that stands out to me would be filling out his frame to be a true kind of power winger, or maybe even if he's not like running people over, just to be able to withstand that. Because you don't want a guy who's 6'2" and kind of plays just a smaller game either. But I think when you just look at the projection and the skating and all that, I think with more muscle and the added maturation that'll come with that, it's not something I'm really worried about, but I think that's maybe one of the nits you could pick there.
Well, I mean, one of the things that we've seen just in, I don't know, Yzerman's tenure as a whole is when he drafts forwards that there's always an emphasis on like the two-way game and being really good on both ends. And I would imagine that you wouldn't be here saying, like pumping his tires and saying that he might be a fit for the Wings and be exactly what we need if he wasn't sound defensively. But just in general, everyone's going to look at the points and is going to look at the offensive production. Does he kind of fit that mold as well, where, he's a guy that on draft night, if he did fall to the Wings, we'd be looking around going, oh, like another kind of two-way player?
I actually don't know that I would describe him as like a two-way player. It certainly wouldn't be the first thing I would say. Like, I don't think he plays defense, right? Like,
yeah.
But I don't know that that's like one of the big things in his game where you're pointing to that and banging the table. And that's kind of one of the things I think makes him so interesting, is that because I don't think it's necessarily like a liability or anything either, but he is that player who I think has the kind of, I don't know, the mix, I guess you would call it, of tools to be something that they don't really have much of in their system, right? Like they have a couple other guys in the system who I think have really high skill, right? I'm thinking of Jonathan Berggren, but he doesn't have kind of the size to get to the middle of the ice and score in some of those like hard ways that we've really seen consistently, right? He's a smaller guy too. And I think he will not necessarily be a playoff kind of perform, although he is playing very well in the Grand Rapids playoffs. I should kind of give him that credit. Some of the guys they have with size in their system, I don't think have the level of puck skill that he has. So it's kind of meeting those two things where you look at what they can lack. Is he going to be a top penalty killer for you? Who knows? But like, I wouldn't say that if you're drafting Beckett Sennecke, you're doing because you expect him to be a Selke winner someday. I think you're doing it because you expect him to hold his own in that part of the ice and be a differentiator for you with the puck, with his hands, and with his skating.
Awesome. That will lead me into my next question, but I'm going to actually hold my tongue in regards to that until after our quick break and we get into segment 2. Again, we're joined by Max Bultman, beat writer for the Red Wings from The Athletic, and we will be back continuing this conversation on draft prospect Becket Sennecke in segment 2, so stay tuned. Got to talk to you guys today about FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Segment 2, Locked On Red Wings podcast. We're joined by Max Bultman, Detroit Red Wings beat writer from The Athletic. And I wanted to talk to you about, Max, you talked a lot about, his strengths and his weaknesses, all that. I want to talk about fit with the Red Wings, right? We've had a lot of conversations here, Scotty and I, about what this team needs going into the next draft. And with the fact that they're drafting 15th and the fact that they've really built up their cupboards really well, full of prospects across the board, goaltending, defense, forwards, different types of forwards. Does he fit as a player in terms of what they need? And also, will he fit them timeline wise as well for where this team wants to go and when they want to get there?
I think so. I mean, I think when you look at kind of their pipeline, the places that they are strongest right now are now center, which was the biggest weakness for a long time. And I think, still pretty strong on defense, even as guys like, Edvinsson have now graduated. It seems like Johansson's going to graduate pretty soon. They're still pretty good there. Goaltending, I think they're in a good spot as well with Kosa and Trey Augustine. Where I think they lack a little bit is on the wings. And in my opinion, that's the best way to have your pipeline structured. I think wingers are the most, easiest thing to find with your NHL GM and you don't have it. You can pretty much go find those guys, or you can go find a Daniel Sprong. You're able to trade for an Alex DeBrincat. We may see Mitch Marner traded this offseason. Like when you want a good winger, it doesn't mean they're free, but they're out there. To find a great center or a great defenseman, it's a rarer thing. And so I think if it were me, I would want to have those things more readily available within my pipeline. But hey, you got the draft pick. Like now I think you're in a spot where you can kind of really think, okay, well, we do need this type, and this guy might be the best player available by the time they're picking. That makes it, I think, a perfectly justifiable kind of selection. I did want to add, Scotty was asking me about the defense before the break, and I went and looked while you were talking. We don't have great underlying numbers for junior hockey players, right? We don't really have expected goals numbers and some of the stuff that I think we would lean on metrically for defense. My instinct watching him was I think he was a pretty average defensive player, right? But I'll say his plus minus for the season was 33. It's not a stat that I usually like to go to. That's a pretty strong plus 33, and plus 9 in 16 playoff games. Holds up with that. So that is a solid state. Now, how much of that is being driven by, whatever the defensive end versus the offensive end, these are the reasons that plus minus is flawed. But I did want to just tack that on there, just, in the sense of being fairness. When I've watched, it hasn't made a noticeable impact on me one way or the other, but I did think that was noticeable, and it fits to this conversation because I do think the Red Wings still need to improve overall defensively. That is obviously including their forwards with the skating and stuff. I still think that makes an impact on the back check in some of those ways.
For sure. Well, I think part of Brian's question is, I don't know, kind of like a variation of mine as well. Like you had mentioned early on in the show how, he has a skill set that you want to add to the organization and that the organization maybe lacks. Is it just as simple as they need wingers and that kind of makes sense because he's a winger? Or is there something more specifically on the ice that you look at and you go, we need more of that specific, I don't know, attribute, I guess is the word I'm thinking of.
Well, to me, what it comes down to, Scotty, is it's not just wingers. It's wingers with size and offense, right? Sure. It's one thing to kind of add a player on the wing that can stick handle really well, right? But as you saw, I think late in the year, that can kind of dry up in playoff hockey, right? It's much harder to kind of create from the perimeter, especially and especially when you're forced to play on the perimeter like you often are in those tight checking late games. So that's where you see a guy like Perron typically steps his game up a little bit because he can get to the hard areas of the ice and create there. Perron also has limitations, right? He's not the fastest player, right? Sennecke is a great skater. He's really skilled. I think he has, and he has shown he will go to the inside. He will make that power move to the inside and use his hands from there. So what I guess the simplest way to distill it is guys who can score in the playoffs, right? Sure. And he is doing that in the OHL playoffs, and he has the projectable traits in terms of the speed, the size, and the skill. Those are all three different ways you can create separation, that you can maneuver past defenders. You can do it with speed. You can do it with your puck protection, your physical size, or you can do it with your hands. He's got all three of those traits. So if I'm looking for a guy who I can say that guy projects to score hard goals, bring hard offense, not just the kind of like shot generated, stick handling generated. This is a guy who I think projects to bring hard offense in the NHL. And that is the most important thing that I think the Red Wings could add in this class.
I'm going to ask you my least favorite question. Okay. I'm going to be forward about how it's my least favorite question. I can't stand it when people ask it to me with like baseball people in like the draft and whatnot. And I think we've talked before, maybe last year, about how it, thanks, Brian, about how it's hard to project, but like timetable, right? Like we take him on draft night. What is the timetable? You know, that's like the first thing people ask is how quick is he going to move through the system? And like, I hate it because there's so much that can change. The kid's a teenager, right? Like he's got to grow into his body, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, you know, before the draft, before he's even in this organization, if you had to somewhat try and project kind of the timetable to the NHL level, what would you think?
Well, I think the best way to do it is just kind of on history, right? And like in the
Sure.
middle of the first round, I think you're probably at a baseline talking about 2 to 3 years, maybe more on the 2 side for forwards, 3 for defensemen, kind of thing. He, like, you know, to the comments about the offense, I guess the one thing I should say is it's not like he had a crazy regular season production as a draft eligible. He was up above a point per game, 68 and 63 games, but that doesn't scream like he's outgrown the league. Now, I think in the playoffs, he's been a really impactful player, but I certainly would still expect to see him in the OHL next year. And if he plays well, then either he goes pro and tries to make Detroit and go back, or he just goes back. But 2 years, I think, is kind of the baseline at this point. 2 years of development before you would make the NHL, especially at this slot in the draft. I think that fits there, but it, you know, wouldn't shock me if he had a huge year next year and showed he could make it. You know, I think Nate Danielson is going to have a chance to make it in the fall after a really nice, especially really nice finish to this season in Portland. So that'd be my guess is probably 2, but like you said, it's all kind of depends on the trajectory.
Let's follow that up with another really dumb question you can't predict. The ceiling as a player, do you think that he could potentially have that top 6? Because that's really, Scotty and I have had the conversations. That's something that we've talked about a lot, is that we feel like this team still lacks a true top 6 winger. You saw it down the stretch with all the mixing of the lines. Kane, DeBrincat, Raymond, you were constantly shuffling them around because you didn't have somebody on the opposite side. There's also the conversation about second line center, which we can have on a different day, but we're talking about a winger. Do you think that Sennecke can be that a top 6 winger and a ceiling, or is he just kind of maybe a little bit more in the middle?
No, I definitely think I would say it's a top 6 projection. Like that'd be my expectation picking him there. I think he can be a top line winger if you want to talk about ceiling. But I think in terms of projecting, I think top 6 is a really, that's what I would envision him becoming. And I think it's because of the skill, it's because of the skating and the size element in there, I think is what gives you even more confidence that he can do it at the NHL level and it doesn't kind of fizzle out as he starts to play against men. That's the reason that I think you like guys with size. I know sometimes people can get on that line of thinking, but what you like about it is that when you get to the NHL, the defensemen are like 6'3", 6'4". And so for you to be 6'2", it gives you, I think, a better chance of translating your other really good skills, in his case, his hands and his skating, to that level, and especially at the most important times of year.
Scotty, do you have any final thoughts on Sennecke?
No, that's about it for me.
I think I've asked all the main ones that I had. Max, when we come back, I want to pick your brain a little bit about the end of the Red Wings season. I think a lot of people here would like to hear your thoughts on it as well. So we're going to do that in segment 3. Stay tuned with us on the other side of this break. Going to talk to you guys today about Policygenius. They are the country's leading online insurance marketplace. It saves you time and money so you can provide your family with a financial safety net starting today. With Policygenius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options offer same-day approval and avoid unnecessary medical exams. Policygenius helps you compare your options from top companies with their team of licensed experts, and they're on hand to help you talk through it. Talk to a team of award-winning agents who will walk you through the process step by step, and your work-life insurance policy may not offer enough protection for your family's needs. And even worse, it may not come with you if you leave your job. And that's why you need Policygenius. They give you unbiased advice from a licensed expert support team. Check life insurance off your to-do list with Policygenius. Head to policygenius.com/lockdownnhl or click on the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/lockdownnhl. Segment 3, Locked On Red Wings podcast. We are joined by Max Bultman, the Detroit Red Wings beat writer from The Athletic. And Scotty and I are going to transition now and kind of picking his brain about the conclusion of the Red Wings season and where he thinks it needs to go next. The first question I want to ask you, Max, is something that I kind of just referenced a moment ago. Scotty and I have had a lot of conversations about what we think that this team really needs in order to take another step forward and avoid that step back, which we were talking a little bit off air beforehand, we think might be ahead of them if they introduce too much youth in this offseason. What do you think that they need to do in order to take that step forward in the rebuild going into next season after missing the playoffs just barely?
It's a great question because they're in a weird spot here where they took this step and then, they're going to have some big contracts hit and they're not going to have as much money to spread around with the cap. And the best way to remedy that for them is going to be with some youth, which I think is something they lacked this year. I think you'll see more of the youth next year. Certainly in the case of Simon Edvinsson, it sounds like they're going to try to have a spot on the roster for Albert Johansson and Jonathan Berggren if both are still with the organization next fall. That's at least 3, and there could be another forward that we're not talking about there. Danielson, Mazur, Casper. I think there's going to be a lot of youth vying for jobs. And what's tricky is how do you work, multiple of those guys into your mix and understand that they're rookies and that's going to come with a learning curve and still kind of take a step forward. It's a tricky spot to be in. I think the things that they need to do a better job with are obviously team defense. That was the big message at all the end of season availabilities. And that is not just the defensemen, that is not just the goalies, that certainly includes the forwards. In fact, I would say in this case, forwards pretty primarily. I think that it was a really offensively tilted group of forwards this season. And I think they have to do a better job of, and I know people harp on the idea that the Red Wings have all this two-way. They've drafted it. It hasn't really made its way to Detroit yet, right? I think if you look on the wings this past year, you're talking about Alex DeBrincat, Patrick Kane, Lucas Raymond, David Perron, Robbie Fabry, right? These are all Daniel Sprong. These are all more offensively tilted guys, right? I think Lucas Raymond will develop into an all-around player. He really started to win a lot of battles at the end of the year, but he was still a minus player, right? And I think at the beginning of the year, especially, you were still kind of seeing some. I thought he really took over down the stretch, but I think you were seeing, their line could have a tendency to get hemmed in at the end of a shift, right? If they didn't make that right change and they get caught, so or maybe play a little loose and a little too freewheeling. So just the identity of their offense, of their forward group last year, was offensively tilted. And I think you'd like to see them work a little more kind of two-way into that. Is that something they can do without giving up too big of term? Because that's something I think they need to be careful about this offseason. That's another question. And what it may lead to is that you get some of these young guys in who have some of that DNA but aren't ready to fully display it against NHLers, aren't able to make that kind of impact against NHLers as they learn. Could lead to a step back, but in the big picture, it's still a step forward developmentally, maybe kind of like a New Jersey or a Buffalo had this year.
For sure. I'm going to put you on the spot here again, and I apologize slightly, but not really.
No worries.
You talked a lot about system there, right? To me, when we have the conversation, and Brian and I have had a lot too about, the system and about, I just feel like since Lalonde's gotten hired, that's all anyone talks about is the system, like this defensive minded type of, system that they're trying to implement more and they're trying to be. Did the second half, we don't even have to split into half. This whole season into consideration, is your opinion of Lalonde vastly different than it was, 8 months ago or going into the season than it was last summer? Or is it still, I feel like we kind of have to move beyond let's wait and see. We're going into year 3. I feel like that's a little bit past, that point, but I also feel like to your point, and this is a point we've brought up as well, there's a lot of personnel like changes that are about to happen and a lot of personnel changes that are still needed on the defensive side too. So I'm just wondering kind of where you stand on him as a whole.
Yeah, I think he's a good coach. When you talk about like system, to me, you're talking about basically two things, maybe three things, I guess. The forecheck, right? Like, are you sending one guy to? Is it a 1-1-3? Is it a 1-3-1? Is it a 2-1-2 kind of thing, right? Like, and I think you can kind of push those different buttons a little bit at different situations, right? You're going to play a little differently, down 3 goals than up 2 goals, all that stuff naturally. And I think you could say the same a little bit on like the breakout, which would be another of those 3, and the D zone coverage, right? So I am not Mr. X's and O's to the level that I could break down and tell you, his system is this good and it needs to do this different. It's not really how, it's not who I am, right? Got to kind of know your limitations a little bit. But I think when we talk about kind of the defensive conscience, which is kind of what I'm more trying to get at when I talk about this stuff, is like, you have to, on the back check, give a certain level of effort. You have to, when you manage the puck, I know there's people who really don't like what they see as a dump and chase system. I put that in air quotes for people who aren't watching on YouTube, because I don't think that is anyone's actual system, right? Dump and chase is something that you do when you have the puck, are pressured, and you don't have a passing lane, or you're trying to get off the ice at the end of a shift, all that stuff, right? Like, it goes into kind of puck management. I think the areas that the Red Wings can improve the most are, for me, the breakout would be number one. Yes. I think they need to exit the zone cleanly. Could I tell you what they're doing so differently than other teams? I don't know that I could pinpoint it to one thing, right? I think there are some things I've wondered about. They play a lot of wingers on their off hands, and I sometimes wonder if that affects their ability on the wall to kind of manage that cleanly. It's a different ball game when you're on your offhand on the wing, on the breakout. But that's kind of the personnel they have, and I think some of it is being willing to kind of take a hit and kind of play through that and know how to kind of hold on to the puck or make your play, and when to just chip it out and get it out. All those things I think are a little bit system agnostic, though, right? To me, that still comes down to players and their traits, their ability to execute some of this stuff. So long way of saying, I think Lalonde is a good coach. I think the jury will remain out on, like, will he take them to the promised land, so to speak, as it does for every coach, I guess. But I just want to, I thought they made really good strides in his first season defensively. And I thought they kind of were stagnant this season defensively, but I did think they had less defensive personnel to work with this season. And so I'll be very curious to see what he has to work with next year. And if it's young guys, I'll be very curious, what does that mean for kind of how he's perceived in that, right? Because you want to develop these young guys. You also want to develop in them some of these habits. It all makes for a very complicated kind of situation. And I've kind of said this twice now in the show. You kind of see where my head's at going into next year. I think next year is going to be a frustrating year to evaluate for the Red Wings. They may get better. They may make the playoffs. It could happen. It's also possible that it could be a step back, which is on the backs of more young players, which I think everyone around this team wants to see. And so it's hard to kind of do that push and pull and have the young guys and get better all at the same time. And that's where I think it could be an interesting season.
Well, and that brings me to something that Scotty and I constantly say. We could make it the show's official slogan in regards to the team's rebuild and prospects. And it is, progress is not always linear. The team, you could see the young guys make their debuts, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, finally the cabinet is filling on the roster. But that them being rookies could then lead to a step back. And that's where, and Scotty and I have had the conversation, it's going to be on Yzerman to, and it's the toughest part of the rebuild, is making that thrust into the playoffs. But it's on Yzerman to create that balance of veterans and young youth to make sure that if they do slide, it's not to the extent we saw like the Senators slide this year. You don't want to be back at the bottom of the division, because I don't feel like that's healthy for the team's rebuild. Now, the final thing I'll ask you, and we've kind of danced around it, it feels like all episode, and we've talked about it a little bit before we even hit record, is who do you think is going to make the roster? You've mentioned Berggren's name. You've mentioned Albert Johansson's name, Casper, Daniel, all of them, all the big hitters. But there's only going to be so many roster spots available. And even though I don't personally believe Yzerman's going to go buck wild in free agency like he has the last 2 years, I think he's going to make a couple of smart signings. How many, I guess not how many, but who are the front runners, I should ask, in your mind, to make the Red Wings from Grand Rapids, Portland, the OHL, whatever you want to say?
Yeah. Okay, so the cop-out caveat to begin is I'll have a way better feel for this once July 1, July 2, July 3 are over and we know what signings they made, obviously. But I know people don't want to wait that long, so I will give you something here. So when I've thought about this, I think there's a couple things that I think you can kind of write fairly confidently in stone here, right? And that's that they're going to need to sign another top 6 wing, whether it's short term or medium term or whatever. But I think they need that. So maybe that's Patrick Kane, but I don't think it can just be you leave that spot on the second line blank. I think you need another difference maker in there if indeed you are trying to get better. I don't think that rules out a prospect also going up and making an impact there. So like one version of the 2024-25 Red Wings. I like that, the bottom bar, Brian. That's nice. It includes like if Nate Danielson has again a really strong preseason as he did last year, and I think his postseason in the Western League is reason to believe that he could have another really good NHL preseason and make this team. A second line that includes Nate Danielson, JT Compher, and a legit top 6 NHL scorer is a pretty interesting second line. You surround your rookie center with a really strong two-way player who can help him out on some of the center duties as needed. Maybe Danielson even breaks in on the wing and Compher stays at center. And you got kind of that true finisher on their other side, right? So let's just say Patrick Kane, even though who knows if Patrick Kane will be back. Danielson, Compher, Kane's a really fun conception for a second line next year. And I think it could be a good one, right? Especially when you think about Danielson skating and the dimensions that it would add to both of those other two guys. That would leave you with Raymond, Larkin, DeBrincat on line 1. Those 3 played awesome together down the stretch. I don't think you want to break them up. But even if it's not Patrick Kane, right, you're just talking about that offensively skilled second line winger. I think that's something they should invest in. Then I think you talk about down the lineup, and you can Christian Fischer is kind of is a big kind of swing factor. If they do or they don't resign him. If they do, then I think you have a really nice line with him, Michael Rasmussen, and Andrew Kopp that was really effective a lot of the time. If you don't, I think that's a really natural spot for Carter Mazur to slot into. I think he would fit kind of the north-south in their game. He's a smart player. He can add some offense to those 3. Might even have, I think he would have more offense than Fischer. Is it right away? Who knows? And then on the fourth line, I think you're talking about if you can re-sign David Perron, maybe he's higher in the lineup than that. So maybe he could be kind of that winger. But, one way or another, I think if you re-sign Perron, he's going to be on your power play. And then it's a matter of how much you feel confident playing him at even strength, what kind of role he's in, I guess, because he's a smart player. He's a good player. He's going to win you a lot of pucks down low. I think you want him with skilled players for that reason, because he'll get your skilled guys the puck. Obviously, he doesn't have the wheels and he's getting older. Can you play him 18, 19 minutes a night? Those are kind of the questions. If it's not Danielson in there, then I think you can have more of a conversation about Casper, who I think came on down the stretch. And I think there's a really nice player down there. I think his game could suit bottom 6 of an NHL lineup, but I also could see them saying, as they've done with previous prospects, if you're not in a big role, we'd rather have you in Grand Rapids. So that's kind of how I'd see it shaking out. Veleno obviously depends what you see, but I think he's a natural guy to keep around as your 4C, and then Fabry on his wing. So you got to do some math to see if everything that I just said works out. They've obviously got some work to do on contracts and on clearing money out too. But that I guess would be my early prediction, or at least as it comes to the prospects, how I could see it happening. But we have to see how it all shakes out. So I think if Danielson continues to look really good, he's the most interesting guy that you could see in a big role. Mazur, I would say he's going to be 22, maybe actually already just did turn 22, and is going to be a good candidate to make the team too, especially with what we've seen in the playoffs from him. The rest we'll see.
Well, and I'm assuming we're basing this on the assumption Simon Edvinsson makes the team. Like, I don't even qualify him right now because he played so consistently down the stretch. I'm pretty confident he's going to be there. But Albert Johansson's another interesting one too, because if again, working under the assumption, because July 1 is going to change everything, working on the assumption you could manage to move Hull or Petrie, which I think Hull's I think that makes sense for both parties in that regard to move. Or Oli Mata, who doesn't have a no trade clause, who I'm fine with Mata. I have nothing against him. He's just easy to move because he doesn't have a no trade clause. Does that open the door for somebody like Albert Johansson to come in who can play offside, played right side with Edvinsson quite a bit down there in Grand Rapids on the right? Like, is there, especially with his waiver situation, I won't ask if he's a slam dunk, but like what probability would you give it that he makes the roster, assuming they don't make some kind of big time splash to acquire a defenseman in free agency?
Yeah. So Yzerman said that they will have to make room for Johansson and Berggren. And Berggren's the other guy I didn't name in there. I think you could see Berggren somewhere in that mix. I personally would have a hard time turning the top six and that kind of Kane role over to Berggren, but maybe they would do it. I could be wrong on that. I think he's more likely as a trade candidate or to be kind of in that bottom six scoring role like a Sprong was in this year, as opposed to in the top six. But I could be wrong on that. With Johansson, he's also out of waiver exemption. And so I think he's going to be on the roster. And then it's a matter of, does he have a nightly lineup role? My lean, honestly, would be probably not right away. But I think over the course of the year, you're going to have more injuries. The Red Wings got obscenely lucky with injuries this year. They did not have, there was one really badly timed one to Dylan Larkin down the stretch, and it might have cost them their playoff run. But they didn't step up well enough in that time, obviously. So maybe that affects the way you view the season, is that they got relatively lucky outside of that injury wise, and it still didn't lead into the playoffs. Odds are that they're not going to be as lucky health wise next year. And so I think that will mean if you carry 7 or 8D, you're going to play them more than you played kind of your 7th D this time around. I would agree that Hall makes the most sense to find a way to move on from, whether it's a trade, whether it's a buyout. I agree with you, Brian, that I think that's in probably everybody's best interest. I think he wants to play more than 39 games. But as for Johansson's role, I think it's probably going to be dictated by health, because I don't know that he's going to be one of their 6 best defensemen next season. Although I do think he has a nice, steady game. There are times that it reminds me a little bit of Olli Maatta. But that'd just kind of be my hunch as of right now, but we'll see where it goes.
Awesome. Scotty, you got anything else, dude?
No, sir.
All right. We're going to wrap it up there. Max, again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Where can people find you and your work?
Yep, I'm at The Athletic, on Twitter at @M_Bultman, and appreciate anybody who reads along.
Sweet. Scotty, you and I will be back on Tuesday, or this is the Tuesday episode. On Wednesday, rather, we'll be back with Andrew Rinaldi to preview the series against the Milwaukee Admirals with the Grand Rapids Griffins. So stay tuned for that. Scotty, you said we ball already, so I'll just say same time, same place. It's your team. Did you not say it?
Nope.
No, you said it. No, you said it before. What?
It goes without saying. It does
go without saying.
You already said. I was like, I haven't talked in a solid minute and a half, so that's not true.
I thought you said it. I thought you said it a minute and a half ago when I asked if you had anything else.
I did not. I just did. We're good.
All right, we're good. We're good. Same time, same place. See your team every day.